The time for silence is over.
So when we got on to the street that lead across the bridge, right on the corner.
Waiting on the other side were Alabama state troopers, under orders from Governor Wallace to stop the marching.
Some of them had on coveralls and jeans, and they was giving us the finger and that type of thing. But for the most part, pretty quiet.
Okay.
And then we got to the top of the bridge. Down below, we saw this steel blue.
Clark's posse was on the sideline.
Blue uniform. And behind the state troopers was the sheriff posse on horseback. And we continued to walk. No one saying a word. And we came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And this major identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march and will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And Jose said, "Major, give us a moment to pray. And before we can pass word back for people to kneel and pray," he said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. And they came toward us, beating up with nightsticks, bullwhips, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. And,
in the film, it looked like when they hit you first, it was like dominoes.
Right. And people just start trampling over each other. The last thing I remember, I was just out on the ground, and I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. And I thought it was the Lions protest. And 41 years later, I don't recall how I made it back across the bridge, back through these streets, back to the church.
Ten days after Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was introduced. It added additional protections, got rid of literacy tests, but it also had a way to prevent any other creative changes.
State governments had to submit their changes to the federal government for approval.
The Voting Rights Act identified parts of the country that had a history of voter discrimination, mostly in the South, and set up federal oversight. So if these places wanted to change anything about voting, like enacting a new law or closing polling locations, it first had to get the okay from the U.S. Justice Department or federal courts that it wasn't discriminatory. Immediately, non-white voter registration in these southern states grew, like in Mississippi, where it went from barely 7% to almost 60% in just 3 years. The Voting Rights Act did what earlier civil rights laws hadn't. When Joseph Johnson went to vote in his first presidential election, this isn't what he expected.
The line went this way in front of our auditorium and then snaked around into our library.
The last person at his polling location didn't get to vote until 1 a.m.
It was the longest line that I've ever waited in my entire life. Some people, they were just like, well, screw it.
The challenge to the law brought the issue all the way to the Supreme Court.
On the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the Justices County versus Holder.
Shelby versus Holder.
I just get wound up when you ask me about voting rights.
But in 2013, the Supreme Court, with a majority of Republican-appointed judges, took on a case about the Voting Rights Act.
This statute is in part about our march through history to keep promises that our Constitution says for too long were unmet.
The issue is why just in these states?
Justice Scalia, it's a fair question, and I was speaking to the aggregate.
Not just a fair one, it's the crucial question.
They decided that the way the law calculated which states would have that federal oversight was outdated and therefore unconstitutional.
Some states passed voting legislation just hours after the ruling. Alabama implemented new voter ID laws. North Carolina eliminated 7 days of early voting. And the list goes on. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, an independent federal agency, says these are the 5 most common voter suppression tactics. They happen across the country, but the only state that has ticked every box is Georgia.
The Secretary of State, I work to secure our elections and prevent illegal citizens or illegal immigrants from voting in Georgia.
One study showed that in communities where more than 90% of registered voters were minorities, the average minimum wait time at the polls was 51 minutes. When whites made up more than 90% of voters, it was just 6 minutes.
7 hours, 45 minutes, and 13 seconds it took for me to vote in Fulton County, Georgia. As soon as I saw the line, I hit the stopwatch on my phone. I spent the first couple hours listening to new Run the Jewels album, and then I ended up listening to the entire discography. And then I started watching season 8 of Curb Your Enthusiasm. That's 5 hours. It is 1 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was like, "Hey, y'all remember we came to vote yesterday, right?"
Not everyone has to wait. This is a map of all the polling locations in Josephs County that had reports of long lines. And here's the percentage of non-white voters in each area. Notice how most places with lines were in less white areas? The poll closures and the other decisions that led to those lines disproportionately affected people of color. And whether or not that was intentional, those kinds of decisions in places like Texas used to be highly regulated and much less frequent.
The Secretary of State, I work to secure our elections and prevent illegal citizens or illegal immigrants from voting in Georgia.
In 2017, 560,000 voters were purged from Georgia's voter rolls. A report later found that black voters were purged at a higher rate in more than half of Georgia's counties. Here's one impact. The 2017 exact match law prevented 53,000 Georgians from having their registrations accepted. Nearly 70% were black.
Other states enacted voter ID laws too, along with other measures that had been previously stopped, like purging voter rolls and closing polling locations. 1,173 places in total, 750 just in Texas. So in 2019, the House of Representatives did just that, passing a new bill to update the criteria for which states get federal oversight. John Lewis, then a congressman in his 17th term, presided over the vote. But the bill passed almost entirely along party lines. Almost no Republicans voted for it, and nearly every Democrat did. Then the bill moved to the Republican-held Senate, where it isn't going to get a vote. And even if it does pass the Senate, the Trump White House has threatened to veto it, arguing the oversight is unnecessary. But the House, Senate, and White House are all up for grabs in the 2020 election. And this is one of the many areas the two presidential candidates have polar opposite views.
Pass the bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. It's one of the first things I'll do as president if elected.
Join me every Sunday afternoon for a new show where common citizens, you and I together, discuss with each other issues of today, where we demand proof and evidence is required, where we seek the truth and will not be silent. Join me this coming Sunday afternoon and take part in America's oldest and most honored tradition.